bearing with us here. We had a few technical difficulties, but it's worth the wait of course. So today we have a very, very, very special guest, and I would like to thank everyone for being here. This is the third presentation on the Sunken Blimp Stage about creative AI. And for those that don't know, we are Sunken Blimp, right? My name is Matheus Tancati. I'm one of the co-founders of Sunken Blimp, and we do presentations on the Sunken Blimp Stage every week, and we call them dive lives. And each week we bring a different speaker to talk about their work, their philosophy of life, themselves, and the topic of their choosing. And then this week, this month, we're doing this series, Creative AI. And then today we have Professor Neil Leach. And for those that don't know, Leach is an architect, curator, and writer. And he is currently, he's worked as a visiting professor at Harvard University, GST, professor at the European Graduate School, Gaofeng professor at Tongji University, and then adjunct professor at the University of Southern California, among others. His research interest falls broadly into two fields, critical theory and digital design. In the field of critical theory, he has published a number of monographs and edited volumes, dealing largely with the impact of importing theoretical tools from critical theory into the architectural arena. Professor Neil Leach has theorized and experimented wildly with AI tools, including Midjourney, which makes him a perfect candidate, for speaking about this technology and what it means to the creative profession. So without further ado, I want to thank Neil Leach so much for being here. And Leach, the stage is yours. And Professor, I think you're muted.
Okay, it keeps, hear me now?
There we go. Yes, perfect.
Okay, so I didn't unmute, so I don't know what happened, but so yeah, today I'm not even sure really of what to say because things are happening so quickly, and we're at a particular moment, I think, in terms of the history of AI and architecture, which is a very exciting moment, but also one that we're not sure what's quite going on, I would say. And on Saturday, we'll be holding a Digital Futures event where we'll be bringing together some of the leading figures in terms of Midjourney and DALL-E in architecture to compare these two models, these two platforms, plus the other ones, and debate what the significance of this. Because in many ways it comes as quite a shock. These diffusion models have had a huge impact. So let me start by trying to explain the title a little. This is a psychedelic sakura outside a Japanese house that I generated yesterday. And I guess AI Spring is a term I've not heard before, but let me just kind of take you back to the origin of it all, to 1956, when the term artificial intelligence was invented or was coined. Not a very good term because it's not artificial, and I'm not even sure that it's intelligence in the sense that it doesn't think, and we can't therefore really compare it to human intelligence. But nonetheless, it does something very special, and the term was coined in 56 for this moment at Dartmouth College in the States when a group of individuals, some of the smartest minds in the States at the time, got together. You can see Marvin Minsky here at the back here. He was part of MIT Media Lab for some time. John McCarthy down here. This is when they got together 50 years later in 2006. And this was the moment when they launched the whole kind of enterprise. And they were expecting huge things to happen. So some of the figures, again, who were part of it, they were anticipating within 2 years they would have solved most of the problems to do with AI itself. But what happened was something quite different. And I want to just mention briefly what the AI winters were. I'm not going to say very much about them, just to introduce the expression. And this is a term that was used to try and describe the moments when, despite all the hype, despite all the ways in which people were kind of promoting this new horizon, this in such a enthusiastic, optimistic way, there were a number of disasters that were in store. This was during the Cold War. And one of the main sponsors was DARPA, the American military funding agency, and they were really interested in trying to find out what the Russians were saying in using AI for translation. Unfortunately, as is well known, there are a number of kind of rather unfortunate glitches that appeared in trying to translate the English into Russian and back into English again. They would get these kind of comments. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, turned out as the vodka is good, but the meat is rotten. Another one was out of sight and out of mind that came across as an invisible lunatic. And so it was really a bit of a joke at the time. And because of this and all the failed ambitions, there was a kind of a huge loss of funding. People gave up on AI. And there were these two just huge moments, we call them AI winters, when really funding disappeared and confidence in AI disappeared. Alongside this, there were a couple of other enterprises which were aimed at kind of promoting the possibilities of AI and showing how capable it was in a more controlled fashion. This was in 1997 when IBM's Deep Blue took on Garry Kasparov, the then world champion at chess and one of the greatest ever chess players. And nobody had predicted, apart from those working in AI perhaps, that Garry Kasparov would lose, but he did. And you can see him with his hands in his head in his hands. And the comment he made at the bottom here, everything we know how to do, machines will do better, is something I think we need to pay attention to. The next step, there were many steps, but one of the most significant ones was then in 2016 when DeepMind produced a system called AlphaGo that took on Lisa Doll, one of the greatest ever Go players. And Go and chess are substantially different. Chess in some ways is quite straightforward, and Go is straightforward in terms of its moves, but the number of variations or possible variations are huge. There are more possible moves in Go than there are atoms in the universe, and this meant they had to develop a different system, and they developed rather than an expert system that was trained in all the games of chess or Go, they developed a learning system, which is part of deep learning, which eventually would prove to be again successful. Nobody expected Lisa Doll to win, to lose, but once again, AlphaGo won. And again, there's this comment at the bottom that Lisa Doll made. AlphaGo showed us that moves humans may have thought are creative were actually conventional. By 2019, he actually gave up playing Go because he realized that AI could not be beaten. Now, this was described by Kai-Fu Lee as being the Sputnik moment, and a certain moment when certain countries woke up to the possibility of AI, especially the Asian countries where Go was the national game. And following that, there was huge investment in AI. Kai-Fu Lee described this as the Sputnik moment. The original Sputnik moment was, I think, in 1957, when the Russians, the Soviets launched the Sputnik satellite into space and embarrassed the Americans. This is what led to the foundation of NASA. It was a great wake-up call for the American Space Agency to try and keep up. And AlphaGo was a wake-up call for the Go-playing nations of Asia. So this is, I think, a hugely important moment in terms of finding out what was going on. At the same time, if we look at what happened by 2006, when these individuals came back together again at Dartmouth College, nothing much had happened. They hadn't really realized the promise. But by a strange coincidence, 2006 also marked the emergence of deep learning, the use of neural networks, of connectionism and so on, which really launched AI and proved really to the world what AI could really do. And that was the revolution, the deep learning revolution that we are now enjoying right now. And it's because of neural networks, because of deep learning, that we can do certain things. AI is everywhere around us, even though we don't know it. It's on our phones. It's catching our spam. It's finishing our sentence on Gmail. It's finding us the quickest route on Waze and whatever else. It's everywhere around us. There are these apps on our phones, and they're all based on deep learning and neural network. So in many ways, there isn't going to be another AI winter. It's here to stay. We depend on AI. It's indispensable today. But the question to my mind is when is it going to happen? When is architecture going to wake up to this particular moment? And architecture, as usual, is often way behind other disciplines. Media art had started engaging with AI in 2018. They'd already had an exhibition. They'd auctioned paintings in Sotheby's and so on. Things had happened. But by comparison, architecture was a long way behind. At the time, the technique that people were using was called GANs, Generative Adversarial Networks, and this, I think, was the first ever use of GANs to generate an architectural image. It was done by Refik Anadol, and he did it by inputting the data set, a huge data set of the images of Zaha Hadid architects, and then using a version of style GANs, one of the popular versions of GANs at the time, to, as it were, hallucinate potential architectural designs through this system. And what is interesting is at a certain sort of moment, out of the computer comes one particular image that is quintessentially Zaha. And that's that image. And that, in fact, was the image that I used on the front cover of my book, which came out in December 2021, but basically in the States in 2022. And this, I think, marks in part of what I would call the AI spring, the fact that there were so many books that have come out in the last few months. It's been a kind of moment of awakening in some senses for architects. Of course, those writing the books wrote them knowing what this could do, but they were all published roughly around the same time in the first half of 2022. And I'm showing you now the kind of what was in 2021 was the kind of the advanced form of GAN that we had. It was a techniques, but it was really the great genius, I think, of AI and architecture. And it's about all the core Himmelblau and possible Himmelblau design. 4 years to put together. So I'm going to talk about what is happening. So this was the image that I guess this is Matthias del Campo, and Matthias himself has published another book in the middle here. This is a Phil Bernstein book on machine learning for the office, Stanislav Chilo's book, and so on. So the whole slew of books that have come out this year, which in some senses mark an awakening. But the one real problem about these books, frankly, is the fact that the images that we're using are now being superseded by these new diffusion models. So the question I was asking at the time was, when will the Sputnik moment for architecture be? When will people wake up to the possibility of what we could have to offer? And at the time, I was thinking that maybe it would have to be a competition, just as there was a competition with Garry Kasparov at chess, or a competition with Lisa Doll at Go. Maybe what we needed to have was a competition whereby AI was taking on the top architects of the world. And this was some of the early works by XPool, where they actually won this competition. You can see on the right-hand side how this rectilinear form has been broken down through a form of topological optimization. And they end up producing forms that are more free-form, more kind of Gehry-esque forms that are responding to the kind of thermal comfort and so on. So this was in many ways a kind of moment, but nobody really, I think, paid attention to this too much. This is the forms kind of being configured through AI. There was another competition in which they entered, which they beat MVRDV, so they beat one of the world's greatest architectural practices. I think Snøhetta themselves won this practice. This is another competition.
Hey everyone, I think Professor Leach lost connection. He should be back very soon. For now, enjoy the freestyle dance in the center of the stage. We can hear you and see your screen, so you're
Okay.
good to go.
Yeah. So I was asking, when is the Sputnik moment for architecture? When are architects going to wake up to the incredible potential of these new tools? And part of the problem is we didn't have images. We didn't really have designs that were convincing enough. We had words, but architects like images. And I was presenting this at the Architectural Association in London, and Patrick Schumacher of Zaha Hadid Architect was in the audience, and he said, but this moment is already here. The Sputnik moment's already here, and he showed me some of the work that in the previous few days that he'd been the work he's been working, the collaboration he'd been doing with Refik Anadol, the media artist who many of you must know about, and using DALL-E 2. And he was just astonished by the hyper-realistic images coming out of DALL-E 2. And of course, most of us had no access to DALL-E 2 at the time. Only a few leading individuals were allowed to use the platform, including, of course, Refik. But it was quite remarkable what had happened. So just to explain, this is different to a GAN. The GAN is based on two neural networks competing against one another. One a generator, one a discriminator, and they're basically the generator's trying to produce images that are convincing enough for the discriminator, and eventually it gets trained and produces good images. These, and it takes a long time to go and train a model to upload it. These are made on pre-trained models, enormous pre-trained models, GPT-3, which mean that you don't have to load these things up, and also you can generate these images pretty quickly. Now, alongside that, Midjourney appeared roughly I think towards the middle of June, end of June that they first appeared, and DALL-E wasn't so accessible, but Midjourney was, and I started playing around with it. This was my first ever image which I produced, which was the prompts. And it's all about prompts. The way that these work is basically they go through the internet and they connect captions with images. So when you put a prompt in, a series of words, it's going to search for images that are related to those words. And prompt engineering is a skill that we'll all have to learn in this new world, because it's vital you get your prompts correct, and it's quite tricky to get it right. For this particular one, I used Zaha Hadid Architects, I used Refik Anadol, and I used Blade Runner. And clearly it didn't understand Blade Runner, but it understood blades, and we have these blades. So all of a sudden, and this was done incredibly quickly. Those of you who have played around with this will know that you can do this, in the space of an hour or so. You can produce a whole series of images like this. And this was astonishing for me. You didn't need to be able to use Grasshopper or anything. You go straight in there and generate these images. I was blown away. Everyone else I know was blown away. And the thought I had immediately was, this is really a game changer. So I happen to be someone who's fond of Zaha's work and Many of my students have gone to work for the office, and again, I was just astonished by what this could do, and such a powerful machine and such a surprise. Having written about AI, I hadn't anticipated this. I hadn't anticipated this, not just yet. It certainly is on its way, but it really shocked me how quickly and how suddenly this appeared. And of course, everybody at this point began to recognize or realize the potential of AI because you could see some material. I then experimented with more kind of rectilinear architecture, minimalist architecture up in the Swiss mountains, and again was astonished by the kind of things that came out that I would never have imagined myself. And again, many of it in the audience will have been playing around with this, and also I think would have shared similar experiences. I went to the desert after the mountains, and this astonishing kind of tray with a beach on top of the building itself appeared. Again, I would never have thought about this thing. And often with these kind of hyper-realistic kind of images, which were quite astonishing. And for me as a theorist, I was trained as a designer, but as a theorist, I not been working on designs, and yet suddenly this whole world opened up. I've been teaching design, of course, but not working directly myself. These are some interiors I did, again, based on the Zaha-based prompt, and actually quite convincing. If you look at these very closely, you'll notice that they have these kind of reflections in the kind of marble floor. Somehow these images had been positioned there automatically by Midjourney on the wall, so you had other kind of Zaha images. The whole thing was, even people in the office who saw this kind of work were really astonished by what it could do. Of course, it wasn't actually perfect, and in fact, if you start looking a little bit more closely at this, you realize that it doesn't make complete sense. This bed here, I don't know, it's just, but the eye reads it as though it does. So it has this potential to really kind of draw you in and to get you to think about it. This is then a series of versions of the Office of the Future, where I was imagining, I was just trying out what we could imagine the future of the office. And again, it doesn't literally, this isn't really a chair, but somehow you read it as a chair. And so, I like many of you, I was just simply kind of blown away by the possibilities afforded by this technology. It then kind of, I think, raises the question, well, what is this impact going to have on architecture itself, especially architectural education? It's a series of furniture items which I generated. This was actually using a particular, I tend to sort of add extra prompts that are not architectural at all. And there was one particular frog from the Amazon with a very colorful frog that was poisonous that I used for these sofas. And something was coming out that I don't know, I was just blown away by it. So we have this tool here, and we those of us who've been playing with it, are trying to learn about it, have begun to sort of, I wouldn't say master it, but at least explore its affordances. I always think it's a bit like teaching in a studio. As I say, I trained as an architect and I've taught in studios all my career, but you do it with a student, you're kind of saying, well, why don't you try this out? Why don't you try this out? Why don't you explore this direction? And that's essentially what you're doing with Midjourney. You can't control it at all, but you can kind of coax it. For those of you who haven't used it, I would just say that there are, what you get, it's very similar, in fact, to DALL-E 2. You get 4 different images generated initially. You can then upscale it, any of those images, or you can ask for variations. And then so you can kind of direct it broadly in one particular direction. This was a chair which I used a shark for some reason, and I guess the texture maybe comes from a shark's texture. I don't know what. You can broadly take it in a certain direction by coaxing it, as it were. And then at the level of the city, in very atmospheric, it's very good at generating atmospheres, I would say, really astonishing. But again, and the one that actually was perhaps most successful was I did one on traditional Iranian interiors, and I got a lot of followers on Instagram from Iran because of that. I know nothing about Iranian interiors. Well, I've been to Iran, but I know little about Iranian interiors. But those from Iran were astonished by it. They were telling me it's not really Iranian, but it's pretty impressive. And the level of detail is itself, I think, quite astonishing. I also did a version looking at Arabic and Arabian architecture, Arabesque architecture, that came out very similar. I personally kind of like, rather than giving it a kind of deliberate architectural sort of prompt, I like using terms like cocoons or pods or something that maybe forces you to think differently. And actually, as an instructor over the years teaching in design studios, I always encourage my students not to talk about rooms, but to talk about cocoons, not to talk about spaces, but to talk about zones. And in some ways, this kind of really kind of reminds you of the necessity to try and think imaginatively on how you are going to describe the spaces that you are generating. This is a cryogenic pod. Are you hearing me still?
Yes. Someone had the mic on, but they're muted.
So, and you can do families or generations of this by simply kind of offering variations and so on. So this is a tool that we're exploring the affordances of. You know, it doesn't force you to do anything, but there's certain possibilities. One of the things I find intriguing about these, and these are just kind of glass cocoons that I was generating, was that at one point I used the expression the form of the human body. And what is interesting is you actually get little bits of kind of these are kind of human bodies that appear in the design itself. It kind of reminds me of the Renaissance, where they tried to inscribe the human body into the forms themselves. There's some kind of memory of the words themselves seems to come out there. But so to my mind, the best way of doing this is not by trying to literally imitate architecture, but to explore possibilities, to use terms that are highly suggestive that can start opening up a new vocabulary of different forms. And so that I see it as a kind of way of prompting us. You know, in a way, we are giving it prompts, but it's also prompting us. When we talk about artificial intelligence, it's not so much humans versus artificial intelligence, but humans using artificial intelligence as an extension of the self, in a form of intelligence augmentation or extended intelligence. And I think that's the way that it's operating right now. We remain in charge, and we're kind of, in some sense, well, we're not totally in charge, but we're giving it, we're trying to take it in a certain direction, and it's opening up possibilities. It's often beyond those of which we ourselves could imagine. So this at some point, of course, raises the question about whether human beings are quite as creative as we like to think we are, when this is producing things that we wouldn't have imagined. And I think automatically it does echo that kind of the comment of Lisa Doll, you know, that basically forms that we might have thought, or moves in Go that we might have thought creative, are actually not so creative. And suddenly we find this thing producing this. I'm also astonished by the way in which, for a domain that is completely immaterial, it is able to understand material textures and things. This is some pebbles that I generated, and unbelievably realistic. So there's a tool here that has suddenly appeared on the horizon, and it is challenging us to rethink exactly what it means to be an architect and what we can do as architects. So these are just the latest, I think, of a series that I've been generating. Again, I use a different term. I talk about this in terms of interior landscapes rather than necessarily furniture or anything, because we need to reconceptualize what we're talking about. So what we have then is something which is, I think, which is suddenly arrived, and we haven't fully understood what it is doing. Now, in the past few days, of course, we've had TikTokers joining the party. There's a stable diffusion. There's a whole series of other diffusion models which have appeared, operating fundamentally very different to the way that a GAN would operate. It's they use sort of Gaussian noise to break down images. In the process of repairing it, they generate something new. And the important point about this is the speed at which things are changing. Many of you will know about the story of Moore's law. Initially, the industrialist, this guy Moore, spoke about how every year the number of microprocessors could double and the cost would halve. This was then applied by Ray Kurzweil to technologies as a whole, and saying this, everything in technology does this. It's a kind of exponential growth. So instead of going, let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, we go 1, 2, 4, 8, 16. And that, I think, is really the astonishing aspect of what's happening right now, the speed of change, the speed in which things are moving forward. So I just want to kind of like finish off with some kind of comments. And I really want to make this more a kind of discussion to find out what you guys would think. First of all, I just recently submitted the manuscript for the Chinese translation of my first book, where I was able to include all these new amazing projects that have been produced. You'll see some on Saturday, Digital Futures, and completely change the illustration. So all those books so far produced are to some extent, not in terms of the text, in terms of images, completely out of touch. And I also changed my predictions slightly in some senses. So just kind of briefly, I think, the first one is fairly obvious. AI is already part of everything we do anyway, but it'll become a central part of the curriculum in every school of architecture. The more advanced AI becomes, the easier it is to use. You can think about how for example, your cell phone, your mobile phone, you can open it through facial recognition, incredibly advanced technology, but very, very simple to use. And as we go through, we can see this with Midjourney, it's actually much easier than using Grasshopper and rendering engines and so on. Architects will use AI for inspiration and become experts in writing good prompts for AI. Prompt engineering is going to become a skill that we will all need to learn. All buildings become intelligent. I think in terms of interactive design and control systems, of course, cities will be controlled by AI. They already are in some places. In China, they are using digital twins to control the traffic. There's a company called City Brain where they're literally controlling the traffic and improving things there. 6 is a more general kind of comment. Facial recognition will mean we don't no longer need passports, keys, credit cards, or cash. I don't think we will. I entered the States recently purely by facial recognition. I didn't even have to show my passport. Number 7 is equally obvious in some sense. Initial resistance to AI will fade as AI becomes indispensable, invisible assistant for architects. I would simply say that I'm old enough to experience the digital revolution, as it were, in architecture. When I was a student in the 80s in Cambridge in England, where some of our professors told us we were not allowed to use computers. Well, that just led to a whole generation of graduates not being employable. Clearly, we need to use computers, and clearly we'll need to use AI. Clients will also insist on their architects using AI. This is something that came out of my research. I began to realize that basically clients will want to ensure the maximum return on investment in terms of when they acquire a site and they develop it. They will want architects to use this to make sure that they're getting the maximum. That seems to me a priority, and I think that architects will go around kind of promoting themselves and how much they use AI just as they promote themselves now and how sustainable they are in their approach towards design. Now, the next one is, I think, probably the most important comment in terms of my presentation today. The entire design process will become a seamless and automated, incorporating all codes, costs, and performance requirements. I'm just showing you a sketching tool. Midjourney is a sketching tool for inspiration, but beneath all this, there is something much more serious that is in the pipeline, and that is to say AI software that has been developed by companies like Xcool that in 3 to 5 years' time will mean that we can do the whole thing from data to fabrication on one seamless platform. At the moment, if you think of someone, the way that, for example, they might work in Zaha, they do a kind of sketch on Maya first of all, then they put it in Rhino, then they do a BIM model, and so on and so on and so on. All that will be reduced to one particular thing in which all the requirements and all the cost requirements, all the performance requirements in terms of structure, environmental control system will all be regulated. They already have a very basic system they're experimenting with already right now, and in 3 to 5 years' time, this is what will happen. And eventually, AI will be able to generate detailed designs completely autonomously. That is effectively what I mean by point number 9. And that itself is astonishing, but it's also, in some senses, terrifying. And when I first started writing my first book, I produced 2 books. because I was a bit like Elon Musk, in some senses, I was really impressed by AI, but I was also absolutely terrified by AI. It is, and I don't think there's anything wrong with AI itself. I don't think AI is evil. I mean, to say that AI is evil would be to subscribe to technological determinism. Nothing is evil. It's a question of how you use it, who uses it, and how and why, and from that point of view, wrong with it. But it is terrifying because it is so capable of doing certain things, and it will become increasingly capable over time. Some of you might know this character, Sebastian Errázuriz. He's a designer from Chile, brought up in London, and now working in New York. And he published a little video about why architects were going to be going out of work, and he's done a recent one on why artists also could be replaced by that. And it's worth at least speculating about what that might mean. So these are the two books that I've produced. The first one on the left-hand side, it's not quite the design of the cover that we used, but the design on the right-hand side is going to be the next one that I'm going to be working on. I had initially planned to postpone that by a few years so I could write more positive things about AI before coming up with the dark side of AI. But it seems it's now upon us. So I just want to kind of throw out this kind of question really to you in the audience, because I'm not sure yet. These tools emerged in the middle of the vacation in terms of the academic year in the Northern Hemisphere, at any rate. So we don't know what impact it's going to have. How is it going to change the design studio, the schools of architecture? How is it going to change the way that offices work? I'm not so sure. Let me just kind of like simply sort of say that on Saturday we'll bring together some of the leading figures. Patrick Schumacher is going to be there. We're going to have Andrew Cudlis there. We're going to have Daniel Bolajan, Mathis Del Campo, Behnaz Farahi, and a whole range of individuals debating this with short Petra Kucha 5-minute presentations and then a discussion at the end. We don't know. We don't know, and I don't know. But it's what I will say is that somebody who has been working on this for some time in terms of the ideas behind it, I am shocked by what is appearing already. It's appearing before I predicted, and I think it's going to have an amazing, enormous impact on architecture. It'll be a game changer in some way, but it's just the prelude of something. What strikes me about architecture, we rely on images. We need to see something to believe in something. And that's what Midjourney and DALL-E have given us. We now can see what AI can do. But what we can see, I would argue, is that it's probably the first it's the kind of tip of the iceberg. We can see 10%, but 90% is below the water. And what is to come is going to be even more astonishing. It'll change architecture forever. Architecture will not be the same. And it's up to you guys, the young guys and the young generation who are emerging, to be able to seize the opportunity and to imagine what you can do with these new technologies. For us as educators, it's even more of a crisis, because basically we are now teaching a generation of students who are going to be at the peak of their career when the moment, the singularity, what I'm going to call it, kicks in, and when AI really takes over. So to my mind, the important thing to design right now is not a building. We need to design the future of architecture, and we need to imagine the possibilities and how we can use it. So let me stop sharing, and let's see whether we can have some discussion about all these things. I hope you could hear that.
Yes, we could hear and we heard it well. This was an amazing presentation. Professor Leach, thank you so much for bringing this forward. And I do recommend that everyone participates in the discussion if you have any questions, any comments. And I would actually like to start, you mentioned a couple of times Patrick Schumacher's position about artificial intelligence, etc. And I had the opportunity of having a conversation with Patrick Schumacher a couple of months ago, before DALL-E 2 and before Midjourney. And then at some point, I actually started, I asked him a question about his position regarding that. And I asked him about the power of language in that sense, right? And I remember I used a reference to a philosopher, and I know Leach, you're a theorist, you might know Wittgenstein and what he talks about communication and knowledge. And to simplify the idea is the idea that Wittgenstein talks about language as a tool for you to, for me to transfer an image from my head into your head, my brain to your brain in a way. If I mention there's a book right next to the window, I can picture this and I'm describing it to you through language, and then you have that image in your head. You can imagine a book next to a window. You rendered that in your own brain. And then my question to Patrick was, what was his perspective regarding, you know, text to image neural networks and how that externalizes the process, and what does that mean in terms of communication and that idea of language itself for humanity, right? Now it's almost like asking this other being that has the whole preconceived idea, you know, their own knowledge that this being has is the whole internet, which is basically the entire world. It's something that has experienced way more references than you and I or anyone that is alive or considered human, right? So with this conversation, I actually would like to know your perspective regarding this idea of language. If language itself will be a barrier, that we won't know the words anymore to describe things to AI, you know, and it starts to communicate with its own language. Will, you know, AI art be appreciated only by other AIs? You know, and we don't understand the value of it because it's above our capability. So I'd like to ask you a question, you know, on that level. What's your opinion about that?
Well, firstly, and most obviously, one thing to realize is that what we have done in the past is to translate the instructions of the client in words into architectural form. In other words, that's been our role. We imagine these things. And that's, in some sense, is why we are now at threat, because we now got a machine that can do that and do it better than we can. So that's, I think, first needs to be pointed out. I think the question about words, I actually predicted wrongly in my book. I assumed that written words would be going out because we'd be talking to our computers. We'd be using our hands. We could, you know, in a way, model things by tracking the hands and so on, and we wouldn't be writing so much. But now it seems that prompting is hugely important, and therefore writing is more important than I had imagined. So I was wrong there. I mean, prediction's always difficult, right? You get it right and people say that's obvious. You get it wrong and you look really stupid. But yeah, I think that the interesting kind of question is one that Elon Musk uses, whereby he says, well, hold on a second. If we have thoughts, we have to translate them into language and then retranslate them back again. Why can't we communicate with thoughts? And the idea, I think, behind Neuralink is that possibly in the future we won't even need to use words. We will just communicate with thoughts. I'm not quite sure whether it would but it does. I mean, I think Patrick is kind of interesting as a character because he is a theorist, right? And he's one of the few theorists who actually, runs a huge design practice. Most theorists we have actually are not designers, not at all. I mean, if you think about, Manuel de Landa, Sanford Quinter, there are many of them out there, Mark Cousins in the AA and so on, who are not trained as designers, who are just theorists. And what this now brings is the possibility of a theorist, of somebody who's using words in a certain privileged way to be able to be more precise about design. So I'm not sure exactly what this is going to lead to, but it's opened up a possibility for people like myself as a theorist to be able to design and have an impact in some ways. So I'm not quite sure what the answer is. I don't think we can get beyond words. I think that Wittgenstein also said, whereof we cannot speak, thereof we must remain silent. So unless you can describe things in words, it's not going to be very sort of helpful. But for sure, it's I think we're just tracking something in a way that we never expected. I never expected this. It's happened. And the question is, how do we adjust? How do we adapt to it? If we don't adapt, we're going to be like dinosaurs, and we're going to die out. And I think the problem really is that most architects have been ostriches, to use another animal, ostriches with a head in the sand. Well, we must realize that this is a new horizon, and we cannot assume that we are going to survive. You know, one of the crucial comments I made when I was talking to the Blessed Arch guys was that one of the most famous comments in history is Henry Ford was asked, you know, he said, well, if I asked people what they wanted, they would say faster horses. And I really think that architects are stuck in this mode of thinking of faster horses, whereas we've got a paradigm shift, and we've got to learn to survive. It's a very, very interesting moment. I don't know what the answer is, but we have to track it, and it's in forum like this where we can discuss it. But what I will say is I think that you guys in Sunken Blimp and also in terms of Blessed Arch thing are developing ways of creatively thinking about what it is to be an architect. And I think that one thing I would say is the term architect, you know, I think we have a lot of deployable skills that we can use elsewhere. They're very marketable skills, and we need to really, rather than see architecture as being eroded, we need to think about how we can expand our understanding about what architecture is, to use that architectural imagination and not just think about bricks and mortar, but to think how we can make a better world. So, I think what you're doing is exactly an example of what we need to try and explore. How can we operate in a way productively and really benefit from these new tools? I'm not sure I answered your question, but yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And I truly believe in that, architecture as a career, if you have to think about what the architect is, my personal understanding of architecture, my meaning that I put to it is the ability to manifest into reality, and that accounts for any reality there is, including these new realities we are developing, creating, etc. And not necessarily, only with our own brains. I truly believe, for example, the whole conversation about the extended mind, how we can use these tools for extend our minds, like Andy Clark and Charles talk about. And I truly believe the growth that you were talking about, the exponential growth, it's scary to think how fast it's coming. Some of our latest researchers and experiments right now are actually doing the text to 3D. And it kind of goes above what we've tried before with 3D GANs, etc., which is unrecognizable, and actually uses the Midjourney and DALL-E 2 images to the core, and artificial intelligence being able to understand and comprehend what that geometry would be. And if we think about, right now we're in a virtual space, right? There's people from all over the world. Before the presentation, we were talking with someone that was from Chile, and earlier this week we were talking from people that were in Germany, and we can ask around and even discover how many countries are in here right now. And nonetheless, this is a space. It was created, right? And think about all of this beautiful artwork that you displayed around the walls. This was all generated with prompts. Language was able to bring those here into this reality. Now imagine when we're talking about 3D, the ability to manifest the actual environment that we are using and experiencing. Now we're talking about almost godly powers, right? We're able to mention how the environment is and being modified in real time. And this is the exciting piece, to see how Midjourney and DALL-E 2 are just a little piece of the puzzle of where we're going towards. And now there's so many pieces that we're finding out and figuring out where they connect, right? And this, I just wanted to bring here an example. I just loaded onto the stage. This on the left is an image created by Midjourney, which is a house, and the prompt was, a futuristic house covered in plants, etc. This is one of, hundreds of the same one. And then with another neural network tool, being able to generate that into a 3D model. And different than cycle GANs or 3D GANs, this is not a collection of points that you have to understand. The algorithm is really trying its best to figure out what that image means with the shading and the shadows, the 3D model, what that is. And then here there's even a video that showcases the typology, and typology meaning the combination of the triangles that make this image. And historically, this is one of the cleanest, 3D models generated by this. So now we're able to actually produce, manifest the same way they're using with Midjourney, the 3D models that make this space, for example, the environment we're inhabiting. Now, connect that with what you're talking about, even taking the words from Elon Musk, the ability of brain to brain. When is that with the next neural link, be connected so you imagine things and that's manifesting in the virtual space? When that with manufacturing and additive manufacturing, like 3D printing, we can actually imagine and manifest into reality as well. That's even, we can go into loopholes and loopholes talking about that, but that's the exciting portion. And I love to see your predictions, Leach. Like everything you talk about, I truly believe, and I can't wait for a couple of years from now. We're gonna have another presentation on the stage, and you're gonna be like, I know. Did you guys see? I was right. All of these predictions.
Yeah, and just to say, I think that what I'm saying is that we don't even need necessarily think about forms. You've got to think about systems and how systems operate. And Digital Futures was frankly a platform that I think it took an architect possibility of how you could communicate and you could form the classroom into a global classroom. And I think you guys are picking up on that. And it just basically needs to. It's a question of how you use that imagination to imagine systems. I've been struck by the fact that actually it often takes an architect to imagine these things. TED Talks were invented by an architect designer. They weren't invented by an engineer or anything else. What can we do with architecture and imagination? How we can rethink the world. And it's not just form, it's systems. It's all these different things. So you're doing the right thing, I think.
Can the audience ask questions?
Yes, of course. It's open for everyone.
Oh, okay, cool.
Sure, yeah.
So I'm actually the founder of one of these startups that's working on text to models as well. And I was wondering, in your experience and also just through your network of knowing people like Matthias Del Campo and Patrick Schumacher, if this is a goal that's, in your opinion, too late to work on, given that we already have text to image. Is this something that people who have more experience in the field will create some in a relatively recent, in a relatively soon time, or is this something that you think is still further out?
I had a discussion with Memo Acton actually just recently, and he's predicting that these tools have yet to be refined. They're very generic tools. They're designed as a platform, but custom architects. In fact, the point is that that DALL-E 2 and Midjourney don't really recognize the names of many architects. It's still, they're quite relative.
Oh. Did he disconnect?
Yes, we did lose Professor Neil Leach once more. You should be connecting again very soon. Your question was just too good. His internet cannot handle.
Model's cool. I've never seen this before.
Yes, and this is the model of Midjourney to 3D, and you can see in the rendering here. I couldn't bring the 3D textured model. This is just a rendering kind of panning around that shows basically what the 3D model looks like, which is actually uncanny. It looks like the picture generated, and we got like a couple. I think we're close to 12 of these models so far. but it's a full-on collection. You can keep reiterating. All right, is Professor Leach
Yeah, it reminds
back?
me of. Oh, is he?
Professor Leach, I don't think we can hear you. What are you saying, Austin?
I was just gonna say that the image that's rotating, it reminds me of the software that Apple implemented, where in their laptops, you can have the laptop facing an object in front of it, and given the profile of the object, the laptop using machine learning can create the top plan image of the object, which, as we know, with so the example they use is like an apple. So you would never be able to only have a picture of an apple and then know what the top looks like, but through some algorithm, they're able to create the top of the apple.
Yes, exactly. And this is basically the same thing, but then using the images that are in the end non-existent, that didn't exist before. So using Midjourney generating objects and then using tools like that to then recreate what that object looks like in 3D. So then we're three-dimensionalizing something. But the interesting thing, what actually is pretty fascinating to me, is not only what it does to the front, right? Because that's something that we can look at a model like this or a picture like this and imagine what that would be in 3D. However, it's how it understands or predicts what the back of it would be. And if you turn around, it completes the shape in the back. And then even though there's no information about what it looks like in the back. And, it kind of imagines or dreams what the back would look like. It completes the 3D model. So that's what I think is pretty interesting. And then regarding the Apple algorithm that you were talking about, another example of a similar thing is what NVIDIA is doing, which is pretty fascinating. The recreation of environments based on 3 images. Like if you see the research paper, the 3 or 4 images of a children's playground, and then it recreates to the tiniest detail what that environment would be. And if you think about, every single trip that anyone has been, and you took 3 different pictures, you can recreate the entire scene and the entire memory. That's pretty fascinating.
I'm Googling it right now. But yeah, NVIDIA in general just had so much amazing software. It's actually overwhelming to keep up with all of it.
It is, and they got the computer power to do so, right? They're leading in computer power. So in terms of training artificial intelligence, they definitely got one of the biggest data sets and power to do so. Professor Leach, can you hear us?
Hi, Matthias. Yeah, sorry, I got frozen out for a while, but I had to join again. Yeah, sorry.
No worries, no worries. So I think you lost connection a little bit after Austin Cabret had asked if it's too late for architects to enter this field, or if I'm referring to you wrong, you might correct me, Austin.
I was asking if it's too late to begin developing a text-to-model algorithm.
So I think I answered this, but probably I answered it when I was frozen. No, I just think it is not at all too late. I think we need customized platforms, though, especially in architecture, whereby it can be trained on some more specific models. At the moment, it's a bit generic and it doesn't recognize many architects or many buildings.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions for Professor Leach?
I have a question. I hope you can hear me well. My microphone is not working very good.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, nice. So first, thanks for this speech. It was amazing. And my question is like, I tried to experiment with Dolly 2 for a while, and I tried to generate some floor plans that instill some kind of emotions. And I saw that language has a huge impact on AI in that sense. For instance, when I ask a sentence such as create, like generate a space that instill the emotion happiness, it created literally an outer space. But when I use the word place, it worked better. And I saw that those floor plans are not very good at creating those floor plans according to what I asked for. Like it failed at creating those emotions, let's say. So is there any way that you can suggest? It can be a language issue, it can be another issue to work with Dolly particularly. When it comes to creating renders, floor plans, or any kind of architectural drawing.
Just my view is, I tried DALI, didn't like it very much. It gives you something immediately up front. What is interesting about Midjourney is that you kind of have to kind of negotiate with it. It's almost like it has become the generator and you're the discriminator. You're selecting from it. And it really involves the designer. You have to be a designer, I think, to really work well with Midjourney. In terms of emotions, I don't think it's going to work. It doesn't work with some things. Verbs don't work, for example. I find that it's impossible to aggregate things. You can't get a flock of birds or a school of fish. There are some things that it's very limited to. But one of the things I just want to mention, I'm going slightly on tangent here, but when I first presented some of these ideas on Blessed Ark, there were a number of comments that came back. And one of the comments was, AI can never be good as I am because I put all my emotions into what I do and AI can't do that. I don't care about the emotions of the designer in the end. The question is whether it can produce a good design. I mean, do you care if your toaster has got emotions? As long as it makes good toast, that's the only concern. There's also a comment made by Yuval Harari where he says, well, okay, so AI is not sentient. It doesn't understand certain things. Does it matter? And he refers to a particular moment when there was a Google car that was crashed into by a human driver. And he said, actually, the fact that the human driver was conscious, was sentient, was the problem. It got distracted. The human driver got distracted. So I don't know to what extent we need to engage with questions of emotions. But I just want to be provocative there. But I think we're just learning these tools and learning what they can do. But certainly emotions is not something that I think that works too well.
It doesn't need to specifically about emotions. I just try to experiment in every kind of way with emotions, with other stuff. And I just realized that when I just basically tried to generate a floor plan, it didn't differ when I changed the subject. It can be emotions or anything else. It just creates plans because it sees the word plan, and then probably AI starts to think about, what defines the plan, as I understood, at least.
No, I try and avoid architectural terms. I mean, the things you can see on the screen right now were generated, I think I use the term cocoon. I avoid architectural terms, and just if you explore new terminology, it opens up new forms. So I would encourage you to completely experimental and try and push the boundaries. So you start exploring other territories.
Yeah, I totally agree. And right now I'm still at the experimental stage. So thank you for your
No,
answer.
we all are. But I do think the mid-journey is going to be is much. I haven't tried stable diffusion, but I've seen some great results from that now. So keep exploring, but be open-minded and see what you can do with this. The thing about the logic of this of affordances is you can see what you can do with it and push it further. The things that you can do, and if you can't do some things, forget about it. But see what you can do. Good luck. Good luck.
Thank you so much.
I also have a question on this, is that Midjourney is available right now only in the English language. What's going to happen, because things change when we describe them in different languages? What happens when we introduce the prompt in Spanish or describe in German or in Turkish, for example? How do you think this might change the interpretation from the algorithm?
Well, I'm not sure what the answer to that is, but I would say I don't think we're limited to images. I think we're going to be working with videos soon. Anything that can be connected to speech in some way. I don't know. I'm not sure. Let's see. With digital futures, we're trying to open up to other languages because it's important, not just to get any English. I don't know. I think in the end that the language that has the most content on the internet is going to be the most useful one. I think that minority languages will struggle to operate at the same level as English. I think, English, Spanish, and Chinese are probably the three main languages, and they're probably going to be the three most successful. But for the moment, there's nothing like this in China. So I don't know.
I have a quick comment about.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, I'm Maria, and I have a question about what you talked about earlier about how you talk about how AI should start being taught in architecture school for us to understand it more. So do you believe that we should be focusing more in AI and stop spending time in teaching the basics such as sketching, drawing, etc.? Or do you believe there is another way to teach this type of new experiment?
I think that education itself needs to be radically rethought in the context of what we're happening. We're operating now in a global classroom in Sunken Blimp. It's a global classroom. And there's more knowledge out there on the internet than any single professor has, in terms of YouTube videos and so on. So I think we're going through, in any case, a radical transformation in terms of what education is or could be. And it's probably because of COVID. It's really shaken up things in terms of how we do things. The way that we try and do in Digital Futures is we trying to make this a kind of a supplementary form of education that's out there that anyone can have access to. We want to democratize education by making it all available for free, and I think that's an important thing. So, because in some countries, I hear that in France, for example, that most of the professors are dinosaurs, and I think that we've got to shake things up completely. I don't know about that question about the basic skills. I come from in UK, right? And Prince Charles was famous for criticizing contemporary generations and saying, okay, these guys can't spell, they can't add up, they can't do things like we could do. But I think the important thing is to see that there are new skills, that multitasking and all these different things are coming on board. So I don't think we should be dragged back in that sort of way to a nostalgic view of the world. I think we need to move forward. And this maybe goes back to something else that I've always felt about architects, that we're incredibly conservative in how we look at things. Every single school of architecture spends time looking at the history of Vitruvius, Alberti, and all these things, right? Very few schools of architecture look at the future. I think we've got to really reorientate ourselves and start thinking about what are the skills we need for the future. And it's not just based on what the professor was taught, 50 years ago or something. We need to really radically overhaul it. So I'm not sure the answer to that, but I think we've got to be open-minded towards the possibilities of what these things are going to afford. And I think, that's all I would say at the moment. I don't know the answer. What do you think is the answer?
I agree with you in the part about how architecture is so closed off to new, how do I say it? To new beginnings. Like architectural is still talking about something that happened in like 200 years ago. And I understand that history is a part of how architecture evolves. But I believe that if we want to move forward in design, in architectural, if it's still scary, I think that we should be, as you said, focusing more in new skills and stop trying to teach something that is not relevant for the work that we will be doing after we graduate.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I mean, just one other thing. One of the reasons why I think architects are conservative is that you have to keep to really the canon of architecture to succeed, right? You do something too crazy, you're dismissed. In the end, we're very conservative in how we operate. Each architect has their own form of, I would call it, signature. You can always recognize a building by Frank Gehry. And we're very, very conservative. We keep to this what we know, and we don't experiment enough. So I think really now is the time we have to experiment. We have to explore these new territories, because I think actually what this can produce is actually a radically enhanced architect. If we use this, as Matthias was saying, as a form of extended intelligence, we really become superhuman. I think that Elon Musk makes this comment. We are all cyborgs. We are all superhuman because of even just our phones, right? And now we've got these tools. We can really reinvent what it is to be an architect. So I would embrace these possibilities and see what we can do.
Amazing. Professor Leach, thank you so much again for this presentation, the discussion. This was honestly a treat. And, it leaves me thinking. I'm sure a lot of you guys are also, thinking a lot. So thank you so much for coming here with us, sharing a little bit of your brain, which is so excited to pick on. And yes, so thank you everyone else also for joining us and being here with us on this Dive Live. If you're interested, make sure that you join us on Discord. Come up to next week where we're going to have another presentation with Ahmed, where he's going to be talking about artificial intelligence and robotic manufacturing. So actually controlling robots with AI and building stuff. So that's also pretty cool. And yes, so thank you, everyone. I hope everyone has, you guys have a beautiful Wednesday. And yes, thank you.
Thanks, Matthias. And also, don't forget Digital Futures on Saturday, where we will talk about Mid-Journey and DALL-E with Patrick Schumacher and others.
Yes.
So that should be interesting too. Thank you.
Yes,
guys.
Of course. Please come. And Neil, I hope I get an invite to that Zoom room.
Okay. Okay.
All right.
Sure.
Thank you. All right. Bye, everyone. Have a good night.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.